was the end of the war, right? Talk about the end of World War II with the Germans and the Japanese. Let's do a little recap. What did you talk about from last week?
We talked about Hitler committing suicide and that was the end, and then Japan surrendering.
Okay. You had VE Day where the Germans eventually surrendered and everything, and then you had VJ Day that was held, and then they surrendered. Why did the Japanese surrender? What was pretty much the main cause of the end of that?
They sent 2 bombs, the little boy and the fat man. Then they said they had another one, and if you didn't surrender now, we'd send it to Japan.
That's right. And what was the reason they wanted that they used the 2 bombs, then use them in? Why did they do that?
Because they didn't surrender the first time.
They didn't surrender the first time, but they were afraid that if we would have used more men, it'd been more bloodier than they've already expected. And they knew the Japanese people were training children and adults and the civilians to fight all the way there. So they were preparing for it. They were sending soldiers that were in Europe, sending them over to the Pacific, getting ready to fight in the Pacific, but it didn't happen. After the Germans surrendered, talked about the Russians coming from the east and the Allies, the Americans, the British were coming from the west, and they came in there. Who wound up controlling Berlin? Which side? The Americans or the Russians? Russians. Very good. Jeremy also talked about FDR passing away from his disease, or from when he got sick and died. Who was the president that took over after FDR? Franklin Roosevelt.
Harry Truman.
Harry Truman. Where was he from? What state was he from? He didn't mention that? Jeremy didn't mention that?
Like Oklahoma.
Close. Missouri. He's from Missouri. And he was also in World War I. Okay, so we got that pretty much taken care of. The war's ended now. World War II's over. The Americans got the western part. The Soviets have the eastern part of Germany. It's split. He talked about that. So now I want to talk about the Cold War. When I talk about the Cold War, this was from the end of the World War II until 1989, 1990. So there's a big gap of things happening in that time period. So I'm going to hit and miss some of the things that happened during that time. I'm not going to get into the Korean War or the Vietnam War because Jeremy will be doing the Korean War next week, and then I'll be doing Vietnam. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about it, but not go into real big detail. Okay, after the end of the war was over, we were splitting up what the Americans and the British were splitting up parts of the Germany that they were taking care of. The Soviets were taking care of where Berlin was. And now it's starting to need to rebuild everything. And so it started coming around with rebuilding and what we need to do. People were still trying to find loved ones after the war and so on. But the Allies were there to make sure they would have a small group of people that would go around and they would try to get governments established back in the German population and try to get things started again. And we have a couple of uniforms here of gentlemen who stayed in after the war to try to get these to make sure they had the police, make sure the judges got elected. So it was kind of like a rebuild, much like during the last Iraq War. When we went in there, we tried to revamp them to have a government system working well, democratic, and get judges in there, make sure the police department's working. So this is the same thing we're doing now in Europe at that time. So the Americans and the Soviets, they were working together, but now they're starting to try to pull each other apart with who could be the big power who could hold Europe. And eventually you'll see this through the other one I talk about. One of the big things that probably hurt a lot of the Germans that were in Eastern Germany was eventually the blockade that the Russians put in there, where they wouldn't allow food and things, and they were going to take care of them, and they were kind of punishing them too, the people that were living in those areas, and they were going to punish them for what they did and all this during the war. So they were going to use a blockade where they wouldn't allow any first aid or anything come across the borders into their sections for they could use. So you might have heard of the Berlin blockade, and then they had the so what they were doing, the United States were trying to figure ways to do this. So what they did was they were flying over with their planes, and they eventually started dropping food, medicine, things like that. And they started dropping, also they started dropping chocolate bars with little parachutes down for the children. And if you go up to Wright Pat, they have a big section in there, talk about the airlift there in Germany. The Berlin blockade was from June 24th of 1948 to May 12th of 1949. One of the first major crises of the Cold War, preventing food, materials, supplies from arriving in West Berlin. The United States, Britain, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and several other countries began the massive Berlin airlift supplying Western Berlin with food and other provisions. The Soviets mounted a public relations campaign against the policy change. Once again, the East Berlin communists attempt to disrupt the Berlin municipal elections. So they were want to get their people in there now and started getting a statehold just like the Communist Party was doing in previous years. So, I mean, you can ask anyone, veterans who were stationed in occupied Germany at the time, and all the way you can through the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, which David will be talking a little bit about his time when he was in Europe and Germany. So, I mean, now we're getting into who's going to have the stronger power. You know, when you hear, first world countries, second world countries, third world countries, and the first world countries are ones who align themselves with us. Second was the ones who aligned themselves with the Soviet Union. And thirds are the ones who never prevailed because they didn't do it to either side. So you always hear these third world countries. But the Russians wind up supplying a lot of these smaller countries and building up some of these other countries that we'll see in Korea, in Vietnam, Cuba, Afghanistan, things like that. And because they're using Soviet equipment. And it's whoever could buy it to make them, and they kind of just throwing things out there to let them sort it out. The NATO came around. The NATO nations still in existence today. They were there to form up a group of countries that would help each other around the world. If something would happen, then they could use it as a military to get together to help if a major engagement would ever happen again, which eventually Korea War does. NATO's, you had the United States, Britain, France, other allied countries that were involved during World War II. The Soviets eventually, they were allowed in, but they couldn't vote on some of the things during the time period during NATO. So they were trying to figure, also with NATO, they would help these other countries rebuild, do things like that. But then they came up with a radio system to they can send radio across the ocean for information, things like that. And eventually, out in Westchester, Ohio, there used to be, a long time ago, big radio towers out there. And those were some of the radio systems they used. And it was supposed to have been for major disasters if the war would happen here in the United States, but also they would radio broadcast information overseas for people could hear. And it was something that they did, and it was, I mean, these towers were humongous. I mean, none of them are standing now. There's only one that's still standing. That's the WLW one that's in off of Tylersville Road. But the museum that's there is really interesting there for the Voice of America plant, and the radio tubes are half the size, probably from wall to wall. That's how big the radio tubes were in there to get it bright and to actually make it work. The radios were in there. President Truman signed the National Security Act Amendment in 1949 with a guest in the Oval Office. Britain, France, the United States, Canada, and 8 other Western European countries signed the North Atlantic Treaty in April of 1949, established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization of NATO. In August, the Soviet atomic device was detonated. So now we're getting to the nuclear part of the Cold War. When we went into Germany, we wanted to get all the scientists that were helping with the rocket programs and things like that, and they knew they were working on something like the nuclear program in Germany, and we were trying to get it, the Russians were trying to get it, so they were trying to see who they can get. And the Soviets took some of the scientists, the Americans took some of the scientists, and the Russians came up with a different type of bomb, and it was very close to, it was an atomic bomb, but it was made differently than the way the Americans made it. So they were going back and forth now, and now they're going to see, well, if they could do it, we could do it. We can have a bomb as they did, and we're going back and forth. And it was a scare tactic. The whole thing about the Cold War was who could scare each other the most. Growing up in the Cold War, I grew up in the late part of the Cold War. Early 80s, late 90s, well, early 80s, late 80s, through the Cold War. When you were growing up at that time period, you knew the Russians, the Soviets were the bad guys. And they were always good at things like the Olympics and things, but they always said they were cheaters. And then, you know, the Soviets would say the same thing about the Americans. And you were trying to get the upper hand on each other. And I'm pretty sure if you ask the adults, it's the same thing. You grew up that they were the bad guys, we were the good guys. They even had drills at that time during the Cold War for if a nuclear bomb would hit, what would you do? And, you know, where was your fallout station? And everybody would have a certain place to go to. And we have around the museum, we'll have these big containers that'll say water on it, and these were put in the fallout shelters. We actually have a can full of crackers from the Kroger company that would have been used and put in these if a war or a battle was taking place with nuclear war from both sides, that you would go to these. I think the one here is at the school. The school up on the hill is where the rally point was, where they had the bunkers where you can go into. I know up at Wright Pat they have. The reason I know, a friend of mine who was stationed there, he said there was one that was so long and so big that you could turn on a light and you could just see the lights click on, and that's how far it went, where you could put people down there. And a lot of times the ones on the military bases were built, had hospitals, had beds, had everything you need to live there just in case if a nuclear bomb would happen. So we're kind of getting a scare tactic, like I was saying the whole time, that we were always prepping ourselves in the United States that we were going to have a war in Europe again against the Soviets. We were taught that from the end of the war in World War II until the Soviets fell on themselves in the late 1980s. But it was who could outspend each other. And the Americans would keep on coming up with ideas, and we were making things, and the Soviets kept on doing that, but they wouldn't put money into their own country, and eventually catches up with them. So, one of your jobs, if you want to, try to find, there's little symbols of fallout shelters, and they're yellow and black, and it'll say a fallout shelter, and has little squares on it. And you'll find them in different places, schools, administrative buildings. A lot of the older buildings would have them on there. They have sirens, they would have practices and things like that. So now, this is the 40s, going into the 50s. The Chinese, everything's being split up after Japan fell. The Chinese, and then they're revolting there. They eventually becomes a communist country. Same way with the Chinese were going into what part of North Korea. Eventually we're going to have the Korean War with the Chinese and North Koreans against the Americans and the NATO countries in the South. But the Russians are helping these countries spread their communist countries. And they're helping spread. We have the Russians going in, and we'll give you equipment, we'll give you whatever you need, and but you're going to be a communist country like us, and we're going to prevail, and we're going to be bigger than the United States. So you started seeing all these countries popping up, one after another after another. After 50s, we had the Korean War went on, and then we started the space race. In the 50s, we started building rockets and breaking records with the speed of sound and things. But the Russians were doing the exact same thing. They were trying to figure ways where they could get out in outer space, and they were fighting back and forth, Who could get faster to the? Now remember, I said they were taking countries, or the Soviets and the United States were taking scientists and rocket makers to their side to make whatever. Well, the first ones to go up were the Russians. Were the first ones to go up, and it was the Sputnik was the satellite that they were sent up. So they were beating us to the race in outer space. Then there's a gentleman named von Braun who was a German scientist who invented the German rocket. And he was really known, but he was on the American side. He escaped to the American side, and he started helping what was eventually will become NASA. And they started coming up with rockets. So they first tested rockets in the air, not going up, but just going across to see how fast they could do it. And eventually they started building them where they were going up. And the rockets they were using were the same rockets they would be used eventually for their nuclear program. So it's kind of scary how they had. These are military rockets they're using, but eventually we're going to put things on them to shoot them in outer space. So eventually, the Soviets have beat us there with their first satellite. They eventually send a monkey up there. Then we start going back, and we actually put a dog up there. We're going back and forth now. Who's going to do this? Who's going to do that? And eventually it's going to catch up, and the United States does fairly well in it. But the Russians are keep on spending money in their military and their program, the space program. So now we're in the 50s, and the United States said we got to go farther and beyond. The United States is kind of in this time period where it's called the baby boomer age, where people were born from after World War II through the 50s, and they were rebuilding their lives after the war. Families, and they had kids and things like that. So it was kind of a peaceful time where we weren't really going anything after the Korean War, but we were still watching what the Soviets were always doing. And they were they were always doing something. And it would always be in the newspapers. And you had the Red Scare, where the politicians were blaming other people for being communist. And they would go to court. And you had McCarthyism, where you could pick anyone. And a lot of times these were writers, directors in Hollywood. Sometimes they were actually famous people that were picked as communists. Lucille Ball, she carried a communist card. The only reason she did that was because she had friends who were communists. That doesn't make her a communist. Her husband was Ricky Ricardo, which was from Cuba, but Cuba wasn't a communist country yet. So they always said they were. Lindbergh was one they considered a communist, and he wasn't. But it went back and forth. And they started blaming these. And they go to court. And they would be on TV, and that's the first time TV's starting to come around where you can see all this stuff going on. And it's scaring, like, oh, this person might be telling secrets and stuff. So now we're starting to get to the espionage part where you have the United States and the Russians going back and forth of, well, we'll send spies over here, and you send spies over here. We're trying to find out each other what they're going on and things like that. There were some people that were caught in the United States that was mostly for the nuclear program, husband and wife. And that's a question I'm going to ask you next week when you come back out. Find out the name of the husband and wife that were convicted of espionage for the United States that were helping the Russians. They were the first ones. So they went we're sending people there as spies. They're sending people over here as spies, and everybody's kind of on the edge. We don't know. Anytime they can fight us, they're going to drop a bomb. Are they going to invade us? Is it something going to prevail over in Europe? Are they going to pervade us to go over there again? We don't know. And it just kept on going like this through years and years and years. So finally, getting back to the space race, we went from sending up dogs and monkeys and satellites. We started going and we wanted to send people up. So there's a movie called The Right Stuff. And you had the Mercury, the Gemini, and the Apollo systems of NASA. And The Right Stuff is really interesting. There's a famous guy who was part of The Right Stuff named John Glenn. He was a politician from Ohio. He actually went back up in the 90s as an older man and went back to outer space. But this was interesting because these guys were picked. Most of them were combat veterans, Navy, Army, Air Corps, Marines. They were picked. And they were picked for their duty, but they went through a lot of testing to make sure they were able to shoot up. First space shuttle, we're working on it. Well, the Soviets finally beat us. They sent a man to outer space, and he goes around the globe 6 times, I believe it was, and then eventually he comes down. And now he's a hero. And the Soviets has beat us. The Reds, they called them. The Soviet, the Reds. That's the reason there was a nickname they called them, and they finally beat us sending someone up there. So we're trying to get to the point where we got to send someone. So The Right Stuff comes around with all the guys who's in there, Glenn, Grissom, those guys like that come, and they eventually come up with a NASA program here, which comes stabilized. Who ran NASA at the time? Who do you think ran it?
The German. The German scientist.
He helped a lot, but there was a politician who actually ran this. The vice president was the head of NASA at the time. So that was his hoopla that he was the one who ran NASA. So eventually we're coming there, and eventually we send our first shuttle. And I'm saying now the rocket that we're using, this is a rocket. This is not a space shuttle. This is something you could easily put a bomb on and use it to explode up. It was not probably the most inventive way of sending someone up there, but they said, this is the only thing we got. When you go up the right path, you'll see the big rockets that's inside the museum, and that's what they were using. First part till we eventually got up there. So they would put a capsule in it, send him up. He goes up. How many days? We started beating the Russians by days in space. How many times we went around the Earth in space. We eventually walk out in space. The Russians and the United States went back and forth on that. So we're catching up with them, but we're spending money, and they're spending a lot of money too. So who do you think's prevailing with spending more money now? Who do you think, the Russians or the United States, with everything going on? The United States still has a small military. They're not small, but they're still an accurate military. The Soviets always put money into their government, military, and their program, and they're not spending money on the people. So eventually I'll catch up with them. So they're the ones who are spending all this money all the time. So the space race continues. Russians have some problems. The United States gets there. They start doing really good. Well, eventually they get to Apollo 1. Now we're going to have a 3-man crew go in Apollo 1, shoot up in space. Now we're going to go, well, how far can we go now? We've been in outer space once. We've been around the Earth. How far can we go out? Can we eventually go to the moon? Well, we eventually, with Apollo 1, we send Shepard and 2 other astronauts in there. They hook up, and they have a problem. And the problem was there was an electrical system with pure oxygen was in there. What happens when pure oxygen hits flames? It catches on fire, right? So that's what happened. They couldn't get out. It killed all 3 of them. That was a big shot for the United States NASA program. So they shut everything down. And the Russians seen this too, and they felt it was something weak, something we did wrong. Well, eventually we found out the problem. There was an electrical system by the company that made the capsule, and the government really didn't do anything to punish them, but the families and the ones who lost, they really pushed, and they started using the media for them and started using the media against them.
What year was that?
We were doing this mid-50s through mid-60s. Eventually we started getting into the other Apollo systems in 68, 69. We started going until we eventually get to the moon. So we went from just shooting rockets where we're breaking sound barriers to sending monkeys, dogs, and satellites to now sending people. But we want to keep on moving farther. We want to get to the moon now. All right, we're going to kind of skip. We'll go back to that part and talk about the rest of these the space program. The one part with the Cold War was, I was telling you that one way they were scaring us was a little incident that happened and scared a lot of people, was the Cuban Missile Crisis in Cuba. The Soviet Union was sending equipment to the country, which Cuba was not a communist country at one time, and eventually it was took over by Fidel Castro, who took over and made it to a communist country. He had help from Khrushchev, who was bringing in supplies and eventually trying to bring rockets in. He did bring rockets and bring more equipment, and the rockets were pointing toward the United States. Now, Cuba and Florida is not that far from each other, especially Miami and Key West, and they were worried to death what was going to happen. So this time was in late 59, 60. Kennedy's becoming in office at that time, and they're starting to talk and said, well, we got to find a way. Maybe we can overthrow the government, because we were allies with the Cuban people. I mean, we played baseball games in Cuba. I mean, the Reds would go down there in the 40s and 50s to play exhibition games against these guys. And remember I was telling you they called the Communist Party the Reds? Well, if you look at old baseball cards or old programs of the Cincinnati Reds, they were called the Red Legs. They had to change their names from the Reds to the Red Legs because they didn't want to be affiliated with the Communist Party, so that was the reason they changed their name. And eventually, in the 60s, they go back to the Reds. But that's a little tidbit. All right, so the revolution happens. The communists take over in Cuba. The rockets are there, and they're refusing to leave or to take them out. Well, the United States is trying to figure out what to do. So the people who are radical, who want to get their country back the way they wanted their country back from the Communist Party, the United States will help you. This is called the Bay of Pigs. If you look on the map, there's a section called the Bay of Pigs. And they were going to send troops. Eisenhower was going to supposedly send troops, equipment, all this stuff to the people to revolt against the Communist Party, get Cuba back, and so on. Well, it fails. The Americans never came to help. The ones who were captured were sent to prison there in Cuba, killed, sent there to prison. But the thing was, there was a lot of our equipment wound up becoming in their hands. And so we had a problem with that. Now it's kind of provoking, well, maybe they are going to shoot a rocket at us, missile. And we know the Soviets have chemical, nuclear stuff, warheads and things, because we've seen them test it and everything. So now maybe we're getting to the cold, maybe we're getting scared now that they might actually shoot at us. So they would have drills in the United States, especially down in Florida, the East Coast, places like that. And they started doing all these drills, and it got pretty scary. I have a friend of mine who was a B-52 pilot, and during this time he told me that he came home, he was home asleep, and his phone rung and said, "Get to the flight line, we need you in your plane." Didn't ask questions, he grabbed his bag, went to the plane, B-52, big bomber, and they're up, they're flying from California, and they start going north to Alaska, the Arctic Circle. So they get up to the Arctic Circle, and they're just 24 hours. They're flying around with B-52. Now, B-52s, they didn't know it until they got up in the air that these B-52s were loaded with nuclear warheads, bombs. Through this whole thing that's going on in Cuba, because the Cubans, or the Soviets, wouldn't refuse. They said, we don't have anything there. And when planes were flying over, you could see it, that they were flying over, and you could see the rockets. And, oh, nope. So he's flying there, and he's just waiting for the moment that he has to fly into the Soviet Union, because that's the easiest way to get the USSR. Drop the bomb, boom. Then they drop a bomb, all right, boom. And then we're at World War III. So it doesn't happen. It falls through. The Soviets start leaving. We actually blockade the whole area around Cuba for they can't get across. And they started going, okay, they started taking the missiles out. Now, they're still a communist country and everything. We're still in the scare of something happening. So after the Bay of Pigs failed, the Americans were still on the edge. You never know what was going to happen. Then we're going to get back into the space race. And so let's kind of see what we can get there. Well, eventually, the Apollo program, 11, 12, were a success. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin were the first two to actually then go all the way to the moon, land on the moon, and get out. And Neil Armstrong, of course, he's from Ohio, Wapakoneta. Has anybody been to the museum in Wapakoneta? If you get a chance, ask your parent to take you out there. It's not that far. It's a nice museum. They have a rock from the moon. He was also a teacher at UC, and he lived in Lebanon for a while. He lived there, and he had a farm. But when people said they would see him, and he wouldn't talk about his time in space, he proud of what he did, but he was okay. I did what I did and everything. And he kind of kept quiet. He kept to himself. Even when his funeral, he kept quiet about his funeral.
I heard he always said that it was his duty, and he did not want any attention drawn to himself.
Exactly. He felt this was his duty to the country, what he did and everything, and he didn't want any publicity. Now, Buzz Aldrin, he gets out, signs autographs and stuff like that, which that's fine too, but it's just his way. So we have we finally beat the Russians in outer space. Finally. I mean, yes, they beat us by sending in monkeys and dogs and satellites, but we finally beat them to the moon. And the Russians could never get there. So they get in there, and through the 60s, 70s, the Vietnam War is going on. You see a lot of the Soviet equipment that the Vietnamese were using were Soviet. They were buying it from them. They were sending it to them. They had advisors. They were showing them how to set their anti-aircraft guns. So they were eventually wound up using it against us. But the Russians still was never there. But getting back to some of the hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union, we did send a spy plane, a U-2 plane. It was a big jet rocket, and Gary Powers was the pilot's name, and he was flying out of Pakistan, and he went across over into the Russian territory, high elevation, taking pictures and picking out things. And the Russians finally, they shoot him down, and he gets shot down. He's supposed to hit a button to destroy the plane for it doesn't get into the Soviets' hands. Well, it doesn't happen. He wrecks. Now the Russians are putting on TV that he's a spy. He's not a soldier, he's a spy. So he will probably be killed for what he's done. And Gary Powers from Pound Gap, Virginia. And I know a couple people that actually knew the family. And they always talked about this. And so he's stuck in prison, and the United States is trying to figure a way to get him out. And eventually we wound up getting him out from the Soviets, through the German blockade there, Checkpoint Charlie, over the bridge and everything. And there's a movie called Bridge of Spies, which is very close to what happened. Very good accuracy in that. But Gary Powers, he could have easily been killed for being a spy. And it's the same thing. We caught people here in the United States that were spying. And what we did came to agreements eventually with the Russians, the Soviet Union and Russians, that we catch you, we try to get what we can out of you, and then we'll say, well, we'll trade your 2 for our 3, or vice versa. We go back and forth. And this happened a lot. In the early 60s, the Berlin crisis in 1961, the Soviets and America's tanks faced each other on Checkpoint Charlie, right on the border, on October 27th. And they started right there on the border, and all these people were rushing across trying to get onto the American side. Well, eventually the Soviets said, we're going to stop this. So what they did was they started building the wall, the Berlin Wall. And they started building it up, and people were still trying to cross over. And they were shooting them and killing them, these German and Soviet soldiers were killing them and stuff. We have a AK-47 that was taken off the wall. We have some pieces of the Berlin Wall. So we have some things here, and it was, people who were on the border will tell you, you didn't know what to expect when you were there and things. So they were going back and forth on the Berlin Wall at that time. The last major incident in the Cold War regarding the Stads of Berlin was post-war Germany. So this was already after the war, between East and West. So that's the reason they put the wall there. People were still coming across. They were digging tunnels underneath, trying to use gliders to get across, hiding in cars. You name it, they were trying to do it. And they actually have a good display of the right pad over that. Okay, so we're going to get in. So talk about the space race. We beat the Russians. The Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a draw. They leave. We leave the blockade. They take everything out of Cuba. Now, with the Vietnam War's going on, so we really don't want to conflict any more than what's going on in Vietnam. So now we're going to start getting into the 70s and 80s. And in the 80s, the Soviets invade Afghanistan, and we refused to go to the Olympics that year, 83 I think it was, because the Soviets were invading Afghanistan, and it was supposed to have been in a country that we were going to go to, that the Olympics was held that year, and we refused to go. So it was the only time we refused to go to Olympics besides the war at that time. But now we're getting that time, so now we're starting to get into, we're still put money into our military, and so are they. We get into the Star Wars program. The Star Wars program was, if the Russians would shoot a missile, the United States and Ronald Reagan said that we have a laser that would shoot down a missile with a nuclear head in outer space. And he kept on talking this to Gorbachev. And he says, hey, it's fine, we got this program. We spent billions of dollars on this program. We got satellites. We've got this. We've got that. The Russians and the Soviet Union started thinking, do they really? Now who's got the upper hand? Now we're making them think, what do we have? So we're going through this. Spies are still going on, trying to find information here, information there. Nothing's breaking apart. We're still in the 80s, still, Russians are the bad guys. And we're still watching everything that's going on in Europe, and we're still preparing ourselves just in case there's a war. So the Star Wars program comes up, they talk about it. They actually come up with TV. At the time it was pretty high tech. They would actually show satellites that would shoot laser beams and blow up rockets. Now, that sounds pretty cool. But we really didn't have anything like that. And they didn't know it, but we knew it in our government, we knew it. And the Soviets kept on putting more money into their military and rockets and everything like that, and they kept on hurting their own people, and eventually they become so poor in their country they couldn't survive. And eventually the Soviet Union and the communists that was in the Soviet kind of fell and disbanded in 88, 89, and 90. And that was pretty much the end of that scare. So as parents, do you remember a lot of this?
Yeah, I remember when Reagan was, I don't know about anybody in this room probably, besides him. I can remember when Reagan was president and the wall came
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I remember when the Berlin Wall fell. I remember when Gorbachev was held captive at his summer home
Yeah.
Yeah.
because no one knew what was happening at that time. The government, the people were overtaking the government. The communists lost control. You know, we had that going on, and we were like, "Is this it?" I mean, was this the end of it? And no one knew. And eventually, Boris Yeltsin comes in. He starts talking about, you know, this is it. This is the peace. We're going to have this, and the Soviet pretty much, that's it. And now the Cold War. We've been fighting the Cold War since '45 to 1988, 90, and now it's done. Even though we still ask people, we still don't trust them, but that's their point of view on it.
We went down to, where were we, in the Dakotas,
Mhm.
and went down into that Minuteman missile.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, where they could send that missile in 30 minutes or less
Yep.
if they needed to. You know, and there were signs, and of course, it all looks like it did in the 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they could touch, you know, they really showed all their living quarters, and
Yep.
they had a, yeah.
And they had them spread
Interesting.
all around the United States, different places
Yeah.
they would shoot off rockets to hit different areas and stuff. And, you know, the Russians were, you know, we would send rockets, and it wasn't just nuclear rockets. I mean, we could send any kind of equipment to different parts of Europe, and the Russians would get very upset about it. They're like, well, you're pointing it at us. Well, we're not really pointing at you, we just have it there. And that was part of the deal with letting powers go, and also the whole mistake at Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis is, we want rockets out of Turkey, we don't want them there, okay, because we had an air base there, so we got rid of them, and then we'll get rid of our rockets in Cuba. And that was kind of an agreement between Khrushchev and Kennedy and stuff that prevailed to how we got out of that. That was a basic from 45 to 1990 of the Cold War. And it was, a lot of other things happened. Don't get me wrong, I left a lot out. But we're going to have, I'll let David talk about his time in Germany and around the wall and the feeling that people went through at that time.
Very good. I'm going to pass a special piece of concrete around here. This is a fragment of the Berlin Wall. So we're going to pass around, let everybody look at it. It'll start here, work its way back. The last person, make sure it gets back to me, please. Everybody stand up for a moment. Shake it out. I'm very, very tired today I didn't get much sleep. We had Valley View School District here this morning. That's why didn't get much sleep. So, all right, let's grab a seat. Justin, I want to talk about specifically the Cold War, NATO versus Warsaw Pact. 1945, Berlin fell. The Russians took Berlin. They lost 100,000 soldiers, 100,000 young Russians. If you go to Berlin, many of their graves are the Russian War Memorial Cemetery is in Berlin. It's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. Shortly after that, the Allies and the Russians, the Allies advanced eastwards to the Elbe River, and there started to be some distrust. And there started to be some situations where the American and English armies would meet the Russian armies, and they wouldn't cooperate. The first American unit, Berlin was captured in May 1945. The Allies agreed at, I believe it was at Potsdam, that Berlin would be subdivided into four, Germany and Berlin would be subdivided into four occupation zones. Berlin was divided into French, United States, British, and Russian zones. Germany as a whole was also divided into British, US, French, and Russian. The Americans and the British and the French normally had the area west of the Elbe River. Everything east of the Elbe River was under the Soviets, the Soviet Union, Russia as we call it. Berlin was about 60 miles into Soviet territory. And here it is, this little enclave of Americans, English, and French, 60 miles into Berlin. From 1945 to 1989, the American Army was engaged in occupation duties in Germany. 300,000 American soldiers. When I went in the Army in 1979, 300,000 American soldiers were present in Germany. Winston Churchill, in about 1948, made a statement. He said, and an iron curtain has fallen from Stettin on the Baltic Sea to the south. The Cold War was an ideological war, a cultural war. We were Westerners. We believed in freedom, democracy, capitalism. The Soviets were very controlling. They believed in communism. So these two extreme opposing views clashed, and it created this inertia known as the Cold War. In 1961, let me back up a little bit. In 1945, the borders started to become apparent. Many of the Germans in East Germany, many of the Poles, many of the Hungarians, many of the Czechoslovakians did not like life under the communist rule. The communist rule was extreme. They did not encourage enterprise. They did not encourage initiative. Everything was a party line. The closest thing we have that today in extreme is the North Korean government. So they began, as Justin alluded to, they began to flee the Eastern Bloc countries. And something you need to remember, right after the war ended, the Soviets were supposed to allow all the Eastern Bloc countries, and that would be Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Poland. They were supposed to allow freely elected governments. Well, they didn't. They propped them up. The communists took control. So these people, not only in East Germany, but all the Soviet bloc countries were under the oppression of the Soviet rule. So as I said, the American Army had border responsibilities. When I arrived in Europe, about 2 months out of the year, we would go up to the East German and Czechoslovakian border. And these borders were interesting. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961. 1961. When the Berlin Wall was built, the frontier fences were built, the border. So East Germany, all the way from the Baltic Sea, all the way to Czechoslovakia, there was a border. And the border consisted of the following. There'd be a border marker, a big red, yellow, black, very similar to a barber's pole, with the DDR symbol on the top, Deutsche Democratic Republic. This was the East Germans. That would be set at the extreme eastern border of East Germany. Further back from that, there were border fences, about 500 meters, which is 500 yards, back toward East Germany. These fences, many of them were electrified. Many of them had concertina wire on top. On the other side of that fence, there was a lane that contained minefields. And further back, there were tethers, these long tethers that the East Germans would harness attack dogs to. And then interspersed throughout were towers. These are machine gun towers. Now, this border was not built to keep the Allies out, the Westerners out. Guess what this border was built for? What was it built for? To keep their own people in. This is a tragic part of about this. And I don't normally talk about my own military. I'm going to sit down. What I remember is arriving at the border in southern Germany. We had jeeps we had reconnaissance teams, 2 or 3 man teams, and we went through a border briefing. This is the enemy, this is the East Germans, this is the Czechs, this is their uniforms, this is how they operate. This is their patrol sectors. And we were assigned patrol sectors. And what we would do is we had a little border camp in a pine forest. And there were these border camps are all over the border. And each regiment would take time, spend a month to 6 weeks at a border camp. You would operate out of this border camp. During the daytime, sometimes at night, you would go on patrol. And the idea was to monitor the border to see what was occurring on the border. What you don't know is back behind the border, the Soviets had 40,000 tanks and about 25 attack divisions in East Germany. So the border patrol was to monitor the border, to render assistance to anyone who was escaping, and to monitor the Soviet army in the event that they came across the border. So what we would do is every morning we'd load up our Jeeps. We had a machine gun on a Jeep, 2 radios. We would, if it was a motor patrol that day, we would operate in 2 Jeep teams. And the border, what's interesting about the border is after the war, there were bridges, and these bridges were blown. So there might be a town in West Germany that's partially in West Germany, and there might be a town that's partially in East Germany. So you have the same town, but you have the border in between. And I can remember, you know, I was stationed in Italy at the time. This is all new to me. I can remember sitting in the town in West Germany with binoculars looking across, and I would see people looking back at us, East Germans. And the difference was very apparent. There was a drabness about the East. There was an incredible drabness. There was no activity. It was just dull and quiet and drab. And on the West, you know, there was freedom and there was a lot of activity. I remember border guards, East German border guards. We would sometimes be inserted by helicopter, and we would establish hide sites on knolls, hills, and we would lay out there for 2 or 3 days and try to record. We had surveillance gear and equipment, and try to record the border guards, because then we can get intelligence. What kind of uniforms are they wearing? What unit are they with? But they were very diligent. The East German border guards would patrol constantly their side of the border. And I also spent time in Berlin, about a month there patrolling the Berlin Wall. And the difference there is everything's so closed in. It's an urban area, an incredible city. If you ever get a chance to go to Berlin, one of the most historic cities in the world. But the thing we noticed also was there was crosses, white crosses, interspersed along the whole border. And you know, you'd see one every few miles. Sometimes you'd see 2 or 3 together. These were East Germans who were killed trying to escape. The West Germans would put the crosses up in their memory. And the first East German killed was a kid named Peter Fechter. He was killed 3 days after the Berlin Wall was built, trying to get out of East Germany into the West. So the experience, you know, as a soldier was really awakening, an awakening awe, inspiring an awakening experience, because here I come from Germantown, Ohio, you know, the land of the free, the land of milk and honey, and you go over and you see how the other side lived. And many times the East Germans would try to cause confrontations with the Allies. And here's a trivia question that you need to remember. Checkpoint Charlie. Anybody know what it is? It's not a bridge, but you're close. I know where you're going. Checkpoint Charlie was a main crossing point in Berlin between East and West. This was the main crossing area. This is where if soldiers, or if people were coming from legally, to come from Eastern Europe into Western Europe and vice versa. In 1961, there was a big showdown at Checkpoint Charlie. 10 Russian tanks came up to Checkpoint Charlie, trying to intimidate the Americans. So what the Americans do? They brought up 15 American tanks. And then, you know, there was kind of a standoff and the Soviets backed away. The interesting thing, too, about being a soldier in Germany, remember this lasted from 1945 to 1990. In 1990, 89-90, Gorbachev, President Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the American president, and, you know, Ronald was a nationalist. He believed in America, he believed in a strong America. But he challenged Gorbachev, and he went to Berlin, and he made a statement. He said, Mr. Gorbachev, take down that wall. And what started to happen was, over time, there had been uprisings in the East. The Hungarians rose up in 1956, but they were put down by the Soviets. The Czechoslovakians rose up in 1968, and they were put down by the Soviets. But in 1989, it started to tremble. And Reagan was really, he was at the right time at the right place, and Gorbachev was at the right time. Gorbachev was the president of the Soviet Union. East Germany started to fall apart. The communist system was starting to lose control. And eventually, the wall opened one night. One night, thousands of people from East Germany came up to the wall, and the border guards were instructed not to intervene, and they tore the wall down, and it opened up. And then guess what happened? Once East Germany opened up, Poland, Romania, Hungary, all these countries that were under Soviet domination for 50 years were free. They are now all of our allies. They're part of NATO, some of them now. So that's why the Cold War is so important. We all lived, and you're not the oldest one here. You're the second oldest one here. But this was a way that we lived for 50 years. And I don't know if Justin talked about it. Another term you need to be familiar with is MAD. Anybody know what MAD is under the context of the Cold War? Mutually assured destruction. MAD. And what that meant was, if the West or the East, NATO or the Warsaw Pact fired a nuclear warhead, the other side would retaliate. That kept everything in check. That's why the world was so orderly, because the Russians knew if they fired missiles, we would fire missiles back. Neither side wanted to destroy or be destroyed. And that kept everything in check. And when we move forward here in a week or so, the world is a more convoluted, confused place now because of that. All right, show you a couple things real quick. I'm going to pass this around. This is a card that was issued to all the American soldiers in Germany. It's called a Smellum card, Soviet Military Liaison Mission. We were allowed to send observers to the Warsaw Pact. Our vehicles were marked. They were allowed to send observers to the West. These were put out there. Every American soldier carried one of these in his wallet. If he saw a car, he would call it in to our intelligence people. They could track where the Soviets were at. So pass that around, please. Stars and Stripes. June 1990, Checkpoint Charlie closes. The Stars and Stripes is the Army newspaper for overseas. When that closed, that was a big deal. Anybody like older rock music? There's a group called the Scorpions. There's a song called Winds of Change. It's about the fall of the East. It's really incredible when you listen to it. It's not real hard rock. This is an East German border guards hat. And this is an East German specialist border guards armband. By the way, the East Germans were the most hardcore of the communists. The East Germans had a secret police called the Stasi. Very, very effective. and they were very calculated and cruel, very efficient intelligence organization. All right, any questions?
I had a friend that was in college with me at Ball State, probably about 85 before the wall came down. She went to Romania as an undercover kind of a person, like a student or something. She went for ministry, but she was there for over a year, and they bugged her room and
Yeah.
everything. They watched her all the time, and she had, when she came home, she had the hardest time because she got used to, there was, in the grocery stores, it was just all potatoes. And nothing in it, any selection whatsoever, no.
The
toothpaste,
communist
no
system
nothing.
suppressed
Yeah,
everything.
everything.
I mean, when I was in Berlin, I forgot to tell you this. So we got to go, my unit, after we completed our border patrol duties, they said, we're gonna give you 1 day in East Berlin. So we got a bus, we were instructed by a liaison officer, he said, this is the way you have to act over there. You gotta wear your dress uniform, you gotta put your hands on your knees when you go through the checkpoint, don't look out the bus. Because you can't provoke the East German communists. You can't create an international situation. So we went over. East Germans had an area called Alexanderplatz. This was their showpiece for communism. And unlike the rest, I mean, you could see the drabness, but Alexanderplatz had all kinds of food, all kinds of souvenirs. We ate for 25 cents a meal. The conversion, I mean, it was unbelievable. But I want to tell you this story real quick. There is a prison in Berlin called Spandau Prison. Spandau. After World War II, the Russians, the French, the Americans, and the British agreed that this is where they would house some of the worst Nazi war criminals. When I was in Berlin in 1980, those prisoners were still held in that prison. And the neat thing is, every week, each side, Russian, US, French, or British, would rotate the guard detail there. So every week, that guard detail would change. And we got to go there when the Russians were on guard duty. Let me tell you, that was interesting. But there's so much history there in Berlin. It's an amazing place. A lot of battle damage from World War II is still very visible there. But John F. Kennedy, the Germans loved John F. Kennedy because he, ich bin ein Berliner, I am a Berliner. They saw what the Soviet system and the communist system was doing to the East, suppressing their freedom, suppressing their right to a job, their right to raise religious freedom, all these freedoms we take for granted. And Kennedy went there and the Germans were just taken with him. And they like Ronnie Reagan very much too. So, all right, any other questions?
Where do they stand today, really? I mean, there's more freedoms now, but
The Germans?
No,
Russians?
Yeah.
Well, what's happened now, what we should also back up to is, I told you about the Eastern European countries that gained their freedom. Well, Russia lost what used to be the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, lost a lot of its geography and its population because Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Russia was Ukraine, they all separated. So what is now Russia is just a small portion of what used to be the Soviet Union. Putin is a hardcore KGB agent background. He's trying to get Russia back under more of a solid totalitarian type of government.
And they're slowly trying to take over like Ukraine, which means...
They're trying, right.
Yeah.
They're trying. And that's why NATO is starting to get a little more active now. Because, and did you talk about NATO?
Yeah.
North Atlantic Treaty Organization, 1949, designed to keep Europe from falling into Russian hands. That was the whole purpose of NATO, to prevent a Soviet aggression and Warsaw Pact aggression against the West. The Warsaw Pact was the Eastern, the communists convergence and organization with the Soviet Union at the center. So,
Real fast before I let you leave, you know, there's many stories you talk to these guys and talk about. And the two that I remember. I remember when the first McDonald's opened in the Soviet Union. They made a big deal about that, but how things were different. They couldn't get things like we have here. And actually, I'm trying to still find it. I have a paper advertising that someone bought a year after the Soviet fell. And the second was Soviet soldiers, American soldiers are very much alike. American soldiers in the Navy would a lot of times throw newspapers in plastic bags, throw them off board, and they knew the Russian ships were coming behind them, and they would pick it up, and that's how they would kind of interact with each other at times. They would kind of not torment each other, but they would kind of harass each other just for fun because both of them were soldiers and stuff. So, but that's all I got left.
Charles Davis was in Berlin in 1945 after the Russians took it. One of the first, he was in the second American unit to go to Berlin. So he saw Berlin, and it's, you know, when this all started. One of the things the Russians did at the end of World War II was they blew a lot of the bridges to prevent the Americans getting their units to Berlin to occupy it. So now, one last thing. People say, why are the Soviets like that? Well, first of all, the communist system, Joseph Stalin was as bad as Adolf Hitler. Let's be honest. He was totalitarian, murdered millions of people. But after World War II, what happened was the Soviets lost something like 26 million people during the war. They were gutted. They were hurt. They lost many civilians, many soldiers. One of the things they wanted to do was establish breathing space between the Western nations and the Soviet Union. That's why they took Hungary, Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Germany and created this buffer zone because they don't want to have to undergo another attack. So, all right, that concludes today's festivities. Next week will be, Jeremy will be teaching on Korea, and I think he has a veteran coming. So, all right, thanks a lot, guys.